I'm delighted to be sharing some of my research on the relationship between exegesis and so something that you would associate, you should associate with philosophy, literature, thinking, and the power dynamics shaping the history of the last decades, actually of the last centuries of the Roman Empire. So in the first place, I should give you some coordinates as to the scope of my research and where it is exactly that I'm taking you. We will be discussing apologies, the slides are okay. We will be discussing the so-called later Roman Empire. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this way of defining the full 2 centuries that mark the history of the Roman Empire. So after the Principate, the time that is better known, the apogee of the Roman expansion, the one in which you have all the emperors that are familiar, most famous, the literature that we usually engage with in the classroom, in seminars. Actually, Rome continues to survive as an empire for 2 more centuries until the year 476, which is famously or perhaps infamously remembered as the year of the fall. Then we might also discuss after the seminar if you really want to speak of a fall of the Western Empire, but this is not my topic for today. What happens in this time? The empire, as we were saying, continues, but continues in a profoundly transformed way. It becomes a very hierarchical, we could say, top-down social system with structures of government that might be well-defined as authoritarian, rather authoritarian in character. The emperors make themselves present everywhere. They ask the population to perceive their presence, and they obtain this effect by disseminating across the empire a pervasive bureaucratic apparatus that perhaps never knew quite the like in the history of the ancient Mediterranean. So beginning from the government of the tetrarchs, the 4 emperors ruling together towards the end of the 3rd century that you can see on the right corner of the slide, one of the great intuitions of these emperors taking power after decades of intense political instability marking the 3rd century. One of their intuitions is that of achieving control for as much as is possible. And they send around armies, bureaucrats. So by so doing, they transform the Roman Empire. Eventually, this new world that the tetrarchs create and that their successors will keep up will also be marked by progressive political and economic instability, leading to its final collapse and the substitution with the so-called successor kingdoms. So the kingdoms that will eventually enable the making of the medieval Europe. However, before the collapse takes place, and this is really where I'm taking you, we're speaking of the 4th century CE. Before the collapse takes place, there is a fundamental transformation, cultural and religious transformation, that affects the entire region. And this, as you might already know, is the Christianization of the Roman Empire. So the religious conversion of the entire population, or almost the entire population of the empire, which is initially a slow but relentless process. And then at some point, the start of the 4th century receives this final injection of energy through the conversion of the first Christian emperor in Roman history, who is Constantine. Constantine establishes a house, the Constantinian house. He rules, then he's followed by his sons, his nephew, to whom we will return in a moment, and their commitment to the alliance between the Roman state and the Christian church determines a proper revolution in terms of the Roman allegiance to religious structures, and this has all sorts of impacts on the society of Rome, ethics, common morality, so the code of comportment marking life in the Roman Empire. It reshapes culture, it reshapes politics, art, and all sorts of things. this is the framework in which I work, in which I do my research. But now I will take you, I will zoom in on my proper research question, which is the question of how the emperors at this time, from Constantine onwards, speak about themselves, about their political vision, their program, their ideological, religious reforms, anything that affects the agency, that defines the agency. And you might be wondering, so why engaging again with this sort of top-down approach to history when, especially now, there are all sorts of projects exploring actually the voice and the agency of the local population, provincials, so everything that doesn't have to do with the traditional historiography of the great men. I think that here what it is possible to achieve by thinking of how the emperor speaks to his subjects is some form of complementarity. So we can see how the emperor, in a sense, is placed at the receiving end of pre-existing conversations among his subjects, the intellectuals traveling and engaging in dialogues across the empire. The emperor is placed at the end of this, he's at the end of the receiving process, and he reflects and the main cultural transformations of his time, and in a sense he gives back to his subjects what his subjects are expecting of him. So by focusing on the emperor in the awareness that he is part of a bigger conversation, we can see to what extent this world was dynamic and dialogic in the ways it constantly reshaped its ideology and transformed itself. So by focusing on the emperor, we can really ask, what has changed? How is the imperial voice a marker of change? Why did the imperial voice change? And why does it matter? Not just to classicists, I would say, but to historians in general, considering the incredible longue durée of the institution of the emperor, the fact that now the emperor appears so different and speaks in such a different way is a remarkable marker, as I was saying, of vitality, of intellectual and political vitality that we should not underestimate. Constantine, I was saying, is really the game changer in terms of the relationship between the Roman state and the religion. He rules for a very long time, as you can see from the slide. He actually manages to celebrate his tricennalia, so his 30 years of government, which is something quite remarkable throughout history, but especially, it is especially remarkable in antiquity. You can imagine that there weren't many emperors managing to round off their rule and get to the year 30. And Constantine is remembered for a variety of things. He was, as we were saying, the first Christian emperor of Rome. He's also famous for refounding the city of Constantinople, previously known as Byzantium, as his eastern capital. So in a sense, he rewrites the entire political and economic geography of the ancient Mediterranean, because Constantinople then will become the superpower of that region. He summons the first ecumenical council, for those of you who are interested in the history of the church. He was an incredibly successful general. He was a general through and through. He was also, how can you say, he conduced a very ruthless family politics, eliminating a few of his close relatives, including his eldest son, Crispus, whom he had executed for relatively unclear reason. So he's known for all of this and more. But perhaps you might be less inclined to think of him as a reader, as an exegete, as an interpreter. And yet today, this is precisely what I would like you to focus on. So I would like to introduce you to a text, a narration that is ascribed to Constantine, the so-called Oration to the Assembly of the Saints, a text in which Constantine makes a big show in underscoring that he is an excellent reader of what we could even define as global literature, because as we will see now, he showcases his capacity to read Greek philosophy, the Bible, and Virgil, and more. So this is one of the snippets I've selected from this very long text, in which he's, let me see if I can close this one, in which he illustrates how good he is as a reader of Plato. He actually even competes with Plato here in the text, saying Plato himself, who excelled all others in gentleness and first accustomed the human intellects to revert from the sensible to the intelligible, did well when he postulated the God above being and made a second subordinate to this one. So here, as you can see Constantine as a Christian reader is implying that Plato had some intuition of monotheism, but also that he believed in another divinity associated with the primary God. So he's presumably thinking of Christ, even though this definition of Christ as subordinate is, of course, problematic in the context of Trinitarian disputes. So we can return to that if you want, but I'll leave it aside for now. So initially, he begins by commenting positively on Plato, and then he says, but in what follows is found to err from the truth, introducing a host of gods and assigning a form to each, which became a pretext for greater error among the most unreasoning people. So Constantine begins by telling us that he is a great reader, he understands Plato, and he understands also the flaws that are intrinsic to Plato's thinking. Moving on, the same text, he reads the Bible for us. He reads Daniel, and he comments on how Daniel was saved in the trials he had to endure, thanks to his faith in Christ. So Constantine, again, as a Christian reader, is engaging in what tends to be labeled supersessionism. So he's rereading the Hebrew Bible as if he were pointing to Christianity, and he wants to make of Daniel as well somebody who has an intuition of the coming of Christ, of the existence of Christ before the time. He says, Daniel, after the dissolution of the Assyrian state, went over to Cambyses, the king of the Persians, by the providence of God. But that too was envy, and with envy the pernicious attacks of the Magi, great and numerous dangers in succession, from all of which he was easily saved, apologies for the typo, with the help of Christ's providence, and easily excelled in the trial of every kind of virtue. For when the man prayed 3 times a day, the Magi persuaded him, so the king Cambyses, to sentence Daniel to be a sacrifice to savage lions. He's paraphrasing for us the story of Daniel in the lion's den, and later on he will provide us also with other accounts taken from the book of Daniel. After engaging with the reading of Daniel, Constantine continues by offering us a reading of a text that you might perhaps be less familiar with, but in imperial times was widely disseminated and very popular, especially among the Greek-speaking parts of the Roman Empire. These were the Sibylline oracles, so collections of prophecies, mostly of Jewish or of Christian origin, but they were presented as if they had been uttered, composed by the Greek Sibyl. So the Greek Sibyl was made to speak as somebody professing either Jewish or Christian doctrinal truths. And here Constantine summons one oracle from the Erythraean Sibyl, saying that she was born in the 6th generation after the flood, was a priestess of Apollo. So he's introducing her, and once, having been led into the sanctuaries of untimely superstition and become full of truly divine inspiration, she foretold in words what was to happen with respect to God, plainly revealing, by the prefixing of the initial letters, which is called an acrostic, the history of Jesus' descent. And here, as you can see, he quotes an oracle from the Sibyl, that was composed by Christian writers, and also the translator of this text has tried to capture in the English what is a striking characteristic of this text, which, as Constantine says, forms an acrostic. So the beginning of each line spells the name, the first letter of each line, if read vertically, spells the name of Jesus, Jesus, and then continues with Christos. So Constantine here is showing that he is aware of how even the Sibyl, once having received truly divine inspiration, meaning for him Christian inspiration, worked as a vehicle, as a prophet of the Christian God. And the final example he gives us in this text to show how well he reads is Virgil, that he cites extensively. Here is just another very short snippet to say that Virgil too was a prophet, a conscious prophet of the coming of Christ, as it can be gauged by reading attentively and against the grain some of his lines, of his poetry. He cites from the Georgics, and he cites also from Eclogue 4, the poem in which Virgil celebrates the birth of a puer, this newborn child. Constantine says, well, to intelligent readers such as I am, it is clear that this newborn child must be interpreted as Jesus. When we look at the court of Constantine, and so the type of cultural conversation that was happening around him, we see that actually the words of Constantine resonate very intriguingly with the ways in which his subjects, the literati among his subjects, were in a sense celebrating him in culture and in art. So here I could show you many examples of this, but I've chosen this very unusual type of poetry, which is known as picture poetry by Optatian Porphyrius, who was a poet living at the court of Constantine, writing at the court of Constantine, who writes panegyrics for Constantine. So a type of poetry that is meant to celebrate the emperor. However, he does this in this extremely clever way by shaping the lines of his poems in such a way as to form visual images, either of the military victory of Constantine. You can see that poem 4 on the left has the form of a ship. This is probably meant to celebrate a naval victory of Constantine, and the other one also spells the name of Jesus, and there is the Cairo, the symbol of Christ. So in both cases, it seems like Optatian is gifting to Constantine a type of poetry which celebrates it, but also demands a sort of intelligent, clever engagement of the reader who is summoned to cooperate in some way with the celebrative process. Constantine, as an intelligent reader, is given something which is not just, straightforward praise, but is layered praise, which is meant to satisfy the clever reader, the reader who can appreciate all the details and the complex elements of what is being offered to him. The last person I wanted to introduce before beginning to make sense of all this is actually the nephew of Emperor Constantine, who is a very famous emperor in his own right, also known as Julian the Apostate. He ruled very little, actually, only 18 months on his own. And the interesting thing about Julian is that he is in many ways the complete opposite of his uncle, because those of you who are familiar with him might know that while Constantine was the first emperor to convert to Christianity, Julian is a pagan philosopher. He's staunchly committed to pagan philosophy and the philosophical current of his time known as Neoplatonism. And so throughout his very short rule, he's committed to refuting the religious innovations of his uncle, and in particular, he is very keen to criticize the way in which his uncle and the Christians read the literature, engage with literature. This is a small bit from his treatise against the Galileans, which is Julian's way to say against the Christians. And here he is very accusatory in asking to the Christians, who are his imaginary addresses, if the reading of your own scriptures is sufficient for you, why do you nibble at the learning of the Greeks? You yourself know, it seems to me, the very different effect on the intelligence of your scriptures as compared with ours, and that from studying yours no man could attain to excellence or even to ordinary goodness, whereas from studying ours every man would become better than before, even though he were altogether without natural fitness. So here Julian is making a very strong case in saying, you don't know how to read, and your scripture is not a good form of training in reading. Conversely, our scripture, the pagan canon of texts, is what is needed to make you a clever and competent and confident reader. And he doubles down in a number of texts. Here, I've taken a passage from his letter to Themistius. Themistius was perhaps the most famous, could say, public intellectual of the time. He was a philosopher, an Aristotelian philosopher, and a rhetorician. And Themistius seems to have offended Julian in some capacity. The background is difficult to reconstruct. But Julian decides to pay back the offense by constructing himself through his letter as the finest interpreter of classical philosophy at the expense of Themistius. So because Themistius was so famous as a philosopher, Julian puts him to shame by showing that Themistius' reading of philosophical literature is faulty, and in this way he establishes his philosophical reputation at the expense of the perhaps most famous philosopher of his times. In this brief passage I've selected, he criticizes Themistius the Aristotelian for the way in which he reads Aristotle. And he says at the end of the passage, "It is you who assert that these are kings," referring to a category that Aristotle has introduced in the Politics. And he adds, "Whereas Aristotle does not speak in the sense of the words that you have introduced, and from what you have quoted, one would rather infer the contrary." What is happening here? Why do we have all these public figures of emperors who are very busy doing things that have nothing to do with literature, such as fighting, governing, establishing new capitals, exacting taxation, and so on? Why are they so committed to showing that they are intelligent readers? And here we need to take a step back, actually a pretty long step back to the first centuries of the Roman Empire, and think of the importance, the growing importance of exegesis, of the practice of reading in the intellectual landscape of the Greco-Roman world. This is a world that is seeing the progressive establishment of intellectual authorities, so of figures who are deemed as the apex, the culmination, the peak of everything that has to do with knowledge and accessing the highest truths. For instance, Plato or Aristotle, whose writings become progressively textbook. And it is on such textbooks and engaging with them and building onto them that the new philosophers of this world become what they are. So they train themselves on these books and acquire increasing knowledge. So philosophy, the practice of philosophy, becomes inextricably linked with the practice of reading competently and engaging with past masters through readings. And the same thing actually happens not just with the canonical philosophical textbooks, but also with other writings, Homer, or the Bible in other cultural environments, for instance, in Alexandria, where you find groups of intellectuals who are interested in reading these authoritative writings with a long tradition and circulation. They're interested in reading them as vessels of superior truths, be it because they regard Homer or Moses as divinely inspired or as philosophically competent, or both things. So they develop what is usually referred to as allegorical readings. The idea that by engaging with the deep meaning of these texts, you can extrapolate a message that is of universal significance, of universal resonance. And this process is profoundly, how can you say, is profoundly, I don't want to say competent, but competitive. Sorry, I was missing the word. It's profoundly competitive in nature, because all these groups, be they, Platonists, Stoics, representatives of other categories, Sophists, they are all, in a sense, keen to understand who among them is getting things right And who has the better insight into how the intellectuals in the Greco-Roman world should be understanding Homer, should be understanding Plato. So the techniques are developed, the reading techniques are developed not just in parallel with one another and keeping an eye to one another, but with intense commitment to an antagonistic type of transaction. At the same time, though, it is not just literature that represents the subject of their investigation. What we observe in the intellectual landscape of the Greco-Roman world during the first centuries of the empire is this increasing sense that the world too is an interpretable space. Being as it is pervaded by the divine, if we think of the cosmos, so the universe as some sort of providentially structured whole, an ordered unity where everything resonates according to the rules, for instance, of Stoic sympatheia, so the idea that there is a deep resonance tying together all the living beings in the cosmos. On the basis of this, there is a sense that the incompetent interpreter is especially the interpreter who is able to decode and to bring out to its full meaning this way that the cosmos has to resonate in all of its parts. So a shared belief among imperial intellectuals, for instance, is that the divine has disseminated seeds of truth, has planted the forms of divine intuition across the world, and that many cultures, so not just the Greek one, but also, you know, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Indians, and so on, have acquired a glimpse, have developed some form of understanding of this deeper truth. Some among the most famous intellectuals have shaped, have given expression to divine truth. And so something that the imperial intellectuals begin to do, and are quite keen to do, is to gather all these expressions of shared knowledge and try to see how they can make sense of the whole, and how this shared wisdom that appears to have been disseminated around the world is also something that mirrors the workings of the providentially ordered cosmos. The point that for me is of particular interest, and that is exactly what I would like you to focus on now, is this idea that the reading of inspired or philosophically authoritative literature and the reading of the world are two perfectly compatible activities. So it is not the case that the exegete of literature is something and the exegete of the world is a different category, but in fact they both possess a set of transferable skills. And this is understandable when we focus on the sense that everything that these exegetes are discussing is divinely inspired. So just as you acquire the correct instruments to decode the inspired literature and see and understand how to read it competently, at the same time, you can take those skills that you have developed and put them in the service of the observation of other forms of divinely inspired and directed manifestations, for instance, the ordering of nature, or also human history, if you understand the human history as a providential event, as something that is guided by providence. So I could give you many examples of imperial intellectuals who in their writings show the overlap between the idea of reading literature and the idea of reading nature. Here, what I've chosen for you is a passage from Origen of Caesarea, one of the most famous Christian theologians of the early centuries of the Roman Empire, and also very famous for his allegorical readings, so precisely famous for what we have been describing, who responds to Celsus, this philosopher, probably a Platonist philosopher who writes a treatise opposing Christianity, and we don't know anything about Celsus apart from what Origen tells us about him, because Origen himself writes a treatise in response to Celsus around the year 250. And this treatise is meant to deconstruct systematically all the arguments made by Celsus against Christianity. And Origen is constantly engaging with the way Celsus understands nature and understands literature. And he's very committed to showing that Celsus actually misunderstands both. So he's a bad reader of the Bible, and he's a bad reader even of his own, we could say, authoritative literature. If you look at the second passage that I've excerpted, he criticizes how Celsus reads from the Timaeus of Plato in the passage which I quote from Celsus, which is a paraphrase of the Timaeus. He made certain remarks to the effect that God is nothing mortal, but only mortal beings, and mortal beings are the work of others, and so on. Seeing that he has put forward views which contradict not only us, but also the not undistinguished sect who are the disciples of Zeno or Citium, so the Stoics, and so on. Origen is telling us that Celsus not only is wrong in reading the Timaeus to the point of contradicting not just the Christians, but even his religious allies, the Stoics, but at the same time, he also gets nature wrong, because he thinks that there is nothing mortal in the universe, but only immortal beings, and he's problematizing the hierarchies between the creation of humans and the creation of animals in a way that, according to Origen, doesn't match the way the hierarchies of beings really work in the created cosmos. There's a number of other exegetes that do similar things, beginning with Philo of Alexandria, the main representative of Jewish Hellenism, Jewish Platonism in Alexandria, up to Gregory of Nazianzus in the full 4th century and more. These are just some names in case you are interested in following up this trend of competitive exegetes in the Roman Empire. But having said this, in the final minutes of my talk, I would like to go back to the text that we took at the start, Constantine's oration to the Assembly of the Saints, and try to explain, having seen all this, why it is that Constantine is committed to present himself as a competent reader and as somebody who sees Christ announced across a variety of writings that do not explicitly summon Christ. In the remaining part of the oration, Constantine switches gears and he begins to read, to interpret something else. He begins to interpret providential history. And he addresses here directly the previous emperors, Roman emperors, who had been guilty of persecuting the Christians, and he shows systematically how they were punished by divine providence. So he illustrates his understanding that the history of Rome is governed by the Christian God, who rewards his allies and punishes his enemies. So I put the question to you now, Decius, you who trampled upon the toils of the just, who are the Christians in hatred of the church, and appointed the retribution for those who live the holy life. How do you fare now after your life? What kind of state are you in? What miseries surround you? The time between life and death showed you good fortune when, falling with all your army on the city and fields, you led the renowned power of Rome to contempt against the Getae. So here he's referring to a striking military defeat suffered by Decius against the Getae, and then he continues with other cases against Valerian and Diocletian. Constantine is showing exactly what I was saying before about transferable skills. So just as he has read Christian providentiality in the literature that he has cited, so now he's finding the same traces of providence in the way he looks at history. It is something that he does in this oration, and he does it also elsewhere. This is the beginning of another letter that he writes against polytheistic worship, recorded by the Bishop Eusebius in the life of Constantine, that begins famously with the expression, Everything embraced by the sovereign laws of nature provides everybody with sufficient evidence of the providence and thoughtfulness of the divine ordering, nor is there any doubt among those whose intellect approaches that topic by a correct scientific method that accurate apprehension by a healthy mind and by sight itself rises in a single impulse of true virtue to the knowledge of God. So Constantine is saying here, if you observe nature correctly, if you observe it with a correct method, the translator has chosen to say scientific method, you see traces of the divine ordering. So if you know how to recognize the divine ordering, you have the tools that are necessary to understand the course of history. You can see how he's legitimizing his allegiance to a new religion by arguing that he is the one of all the Roman emperors of history who has actually understood providence correctly. So he has understood that the real providence of Rome is not the one directed by the pagan gods, is directed by Christian God, and is now showcasing it in his literature, in his orations, by advertising himself as a competent reader of literature and as a competent reader of history of nature, because the two things are the two faces of the same coin. And here I might have to begin to wrap things up, but I just wanted to add that Julian, as I was telling before, his nephew, the apostate, so the pagan philosopher, is extremely keen to refute Constantine on this point, and in a satire known as the Caesars, a satire of his predecessors, where he wants to, imperial predecessors, where he wants to show Constantine as the worst emperor who ever lived. Among other things, he represents Constantine as somebody who speaks to the gods. This satire takes place in the heaven. It's a banquet of the gods where all the past emperors participate. So Constantine is represented as speaking to the gods and constantly misunderstanding what the gods want from him and how he should be talking to them. So not only he's a bad reader of the room, he gets providence systematically wrong. He gets the will of the gods systematically wrong, which is one of the many ways in which Julian deconstructs through his life the legacy of his uncle. So, getting to the consequences of all this, it might seem to you that this is a small debate among emperors, a sort of intellectual divertissement even. But if you think of the impact of this type of debates in the imperial court and how these debates were disseminated from the imperial court to all the intellectuals of the empire, you appreciate actually the importance of legitimizing Christianity as the philosophy of those who are most competent at reading literature, nature, and history. And you see that this is part of a sort of, is a project of intellectual takeover, is a proper politics of reading, if you want to call it in this way, by means of which Christian leaders, beginning with Constantine, reassure the elites of the empire that their conversion will not be to the detriment of the Roman state, but that conversely they are those who have understood better what should be the new course of action, how it is that the Roman state should lead itself, and they are also reassuring so the elites who were accustomed to this type of exegetical rivalries, as I was saying before, they are reassuring them that also Christian intellectuals can participate in these dynamics and in these debates, and can in fact trample over their adversaries and their interlocutors, so they have the best reply to everything. This means that it facilitates the rooting of a specific type of intellectual and philosophical Christianity at the imperial court, which is in a sense the type of Christianity initiating all the theological debates, the Christological debates, which will shape the life of the church in its earliest centuries. And it also determines, and this is really the last thing I'll say before wrapping up, it determines an age, it initiates an age of cultural systematization, in the sense that now that Christianity has become institutional and is the religion that is upheld by the emperor, by the court, and by the high officials in the court, all these Christian intellectuals are asking themselves correctly the same question that Constantine was raising in his passages, which is how do we read the literature of the past? What is it that we can preserve and save in the light of our new values, our new worldview, our intellectual system, and what is it that should be discarded? What should we drop? Is there still anything that we can learn from these authors of the past? And if you want to think about it, and this is my final provocation in a sense for to wrap up this seminar and the point on which I would like to end, this collective questioning of the value and the meaning of the past literature of Greece and Rome is absolutely foundational to the making of the so-called classical canon. So the authors that we read, that we have read in the classrooms of a classics faculty have been filtered precisely by these political and intellectual dynamics that I've been describing for you. So these are texts that have been selected not just by the pagan intellectuals of the first centuries of the Roman Empire, but most importantly at this critical stage, this critical age of reconceptualization of the cultural and intellectual priorities of the later Roman Empire, which in a sense means that perhaps the idea of classics and what we have now, classics, would not have existed in the same way without the politics of interpretation put forward by and beginning with the Christian court of Emperor Constantine and his successors. Thank you for your attention. And I think I might stop screen sharing.
Thank you very much, Lea. Just to repeat, if you want to add any more questions to the chat, please do use the Q&A box. I mean, one to start with, Lea, is so you're emphasizing this notion of reading a lot. I mean, can you tell us a bit more about the kind of nuts and bolts of reading? I mean, when you're talking about someone reading one of these texts, how was it done? Did they have libraries? What kind of what's the kind of realian of reading in the imperial court, and how were these texts being produced, copied? I mean, if there's such an intensive interest, it sounds like that would also encourage an increase in, I don't know, book culture, for example.
Yes, this is a fundamental point, and I should say that while I don't personally engage that much in my scholarship with the materiality of reading, there is a thriving now body of scholarship that does precisely that, because this culture of reading does actually bring about a lot of technological innovations in the making of actually in the fortune in shaping the codex, so the book, which really takes over from the 4th century, more or less, this time onwards. Eusebius, the bishop that I was mentioning before, is remembered also because of his invention of the tabula. There was a system of cross-referencing, enabling the readers of the Gospels to actually compare the Gospels simultaneously. Origen as well, that he invents the hexapla, so this idea of putting the Bible, different editions of the Bible and versions of the Bible in columns, so as to be able to read them simultaneously. And another interesting thing is that, so Constantine had 3 sons. plus the one that he executed, so he actually had 4. But of these sons, the most long-living one, Constantius II, actually ruled for 20 years. He has been relatively marginalized by historiography because, of course, he has been squashed by Constantine on the one hand and Julian on the other, so that didn't do well to his popularity. But a striking thing is that Constantius II is the founder of the Library of Constantinople. So he is the one who is committed, and we know it from an oration by Themisius, the public intellectual. He is committed to transforming Constantinople into this new cultural center. It is a library with scriptorium, so he wants all the great classics to be collected there, to be transcribed there and preserved for the new capital. And I think this is all part of this culture.
So another question is, I mean, I think people were very interested in some of your comments towards the end about canon formation and the way in which late antiquity has kind of selected and presented much of classical antiquity in terms of its literature. But were there any texts and authors that they really found it hard to co-opt or bring on board? I mean, for example, people are wondering about Attic comedy, or some kinds of the Roman erotic poets and so on. It would be hard to imagine them playing much of a role in Constantine's intellectual reappraisals. So were there any aspects of the literature that they were familiar with that they actually decided couldn't be brought into this big tent?
Yes, this is, it's spot on. This is the downfall of comedy, is the downfall, as you could imagine, also of Epicurus and, of course, every type of Greek philosophical theory that denies. Interestingly, though, it is not just the Christian intellectuals of the time who are critical of these authors. There is something striking. So when Julian the Apostate tries to reform the pagan clergy in response to the religious politics of his uncle and cousins, he writes, among other things, this fascinating document in which he lists the qualities of the pagan priest. He says how a pagan priest should think, behave, and also what should be the training, the literary education of the pagan priest. And then he says explicitly, priests should only read Plato, no love literature, no atheists among the philosophers, and no comedy. So it's precisely those. He himself, because he's trying to present pagan culture as, as reputable as the Bible, he's very wary of certain types of.
Right. Yeah. And then another. I mean, this is a big question, but I think it's. I'd be interested to hear what you say about it. Is the question of Greek versus Latin, and who chooses to write in which language? Is everyone more or less at this stage expected to be bilingual and able to access the often complex and subtle literature of Greece and of Rome? So working in, I mean, I'm guessing the oration you began with, Constantine's oration, was that first delivered in Latin or in Greek?
It is preserved in Greek. Constantine was a Latin speaker, but so the problem there is that we don't know exactly the location of the oration, but there are good arguments, at least I think, to suspect that it was composed after the conquest of the East, the Greek-speaking East, and that therefore it was delivered in Greek. But it is possible that Constantine might have written it in Latin and that it was then translated for the delivery, because Eusebius, who preserves it with other letters of Constantine, tells us that Constantine had official translators. So he's, but I mean, there is a critical question, because this is because of the influence of Platonic philosophy in the theology of the Greek East, this is really this intellectualization of the debate is really something that dominates the Greek side of the world, at least in the early 4th century. So I would say that who is the great ideologist of the Christian Empire, Eusebius, writes everything in Greek, and he has a Greek audience. And this works well because Constantinople now becomes really the leading city in the political life of the empire. It will be that for some time Julian was probably he too bilingual because he was a general. The language of the army was Latin, but he makes a point of never citing Latin stuff in his poetry. He was born in Constantinople, Platonic philosopher, only writes in Greek, very proud about that. So they were all fairly bilingual at the level of the upper class, but there is a politics of language as well as, yeah. Maybe the last thing I could say on this part,
Yes.
however, is that at some point from the late 4th century, you will have critical figures in this conversation from Jerome to Augustine, who, even though they write in Latin, they absorb important aspects of this conversation, so they bring it to the West. But at the time of Constantine, it's mostly an Eastern matter.
And in terms of their reading the Bible, then, I
Yes.
mean, were they aware, interested in translations of the original text? I mean, did they read it in Greek? Were they thinking about reading beyond the Greek into the languages that it was originally composed in?
So this is another huge topic. So you know that the Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, was extremely authoritative in the Greek East, and so you do have, for instance, Philo of Alexandria that I was mentioning before, the most important representative of Jewish Platonism in Alexandria. He had very little Hebrew, and everything that he does, he properly invents the allegory of the Bible merger, is on the Greek text. So he's very committed, like other intellectuals of the time, in saying that the Greek translation is as good as the Hebrew text, is divinely inspired. There is the whole legend of the sages who gather in the island of Pharos, divinely inspired, and their translation is perfect and reflects the word of God. So there is a whole ideological apparatus there put up to legitimize the Greek text. In the Latin side of things, the history is more complicated because at some point, actually, Jerome decides to engage with the matter and to do a translation into the Latin from the Hebrew, so skipping the Greek, and that will become the Vulgate. So the most authoritative translation in the West, and the one that really shapes the religious history of the West, and that is not from the Greek, it's from the Hebrew, because he says you need to go back to the original.
Right, interesting. Interesting. Yeah. Yes. So so it's a linguistically diverse empire, but would you say Greek is the language of the intellectuals still? I mean, is that really the kind of overall picture?
Yes, I think is the language of those who are interested in metaphysics.
Right.
Simply. And we see it, for instance, when we have the first debates about heresy between the West and the East. They are very different in nature. So the most famous heresy in the early 4th century West is that of the Donatists. And the Donatists are not interested in metaphysics. They are just rigorists. They think that you should be a very strict practitioner of Christian rights, and for the general orthodoxy, they're a bit too strict. So it's the reason why they're considered heretics. While in the East, you have figures like Arius of Alexandria, whose entire problem is about the existence of Christ in time or out of time, and whether the definability of the essence of God as opposed to the attributes of gods. It's a completely different type of discussion.
Good. And then two questions to finish that are a bit more general. So
Yes.
One is uh, we heard from Tim Whitmarsh 2 or 3 weeks ago about work on literature of later antiquity, and he had some really interesting things to say about why people are getting increasingly interested in this period and what the innovations are. So in terms of where you think thinking about late antiquity will go in the next 10, 20 years, and I'm interested in particular in what you think its effect will be on classics as we know it as a university course. I mean, do you think there are ways in which this kind of move into late antiquity ought to change, as it were, the way we teach first years and so on?
It's a tough question because I think that we can derive some inspirations from late antique studies, especially the ways in which late antique studies is built from the start it tries to it's a discipline that tries to capture almost of a global market of ideas in a way that is quite striking. So I think that we can work with that. At the same time, though, it is obvious that well, I'm not too sure. I do think that late antiquity has its specificities, and while it can contribute to the general conversation, of course, we cannot map everything on the model of late antique studies. So
Okay,
it's
that's
its own
fair.
branch in some ways. Yeah.
And then finally, if someone were to have listened to you today and want um, to get interested and start reading some of this material for themselves, where are they? Where would you start? And where are these kinds of texts and so on available? Particularly, I suppose, available translations of some important works that of the kind you were mentioning.
Oh, yes, of course. There is translations available of almost the main authors, almost all the main authors of the fourth century. Honestly, what I say in this case is always start with Julian, because Julian is a very, how can I say, is a very eccentric author in some way, quite quirky. He wrote satires about himself. Never known of any other emperor in history who has done something like that. He has written a lot of letters, but with his eccentricity, he's also, this is my argument at least, yeah, he's a very exact mirror of the cultural dynamics of his time. In a sense, he is responding to everything with his very unique style. So for me, Julian has been the best entry point in the history of late antiquity, and I think that based on my experience, he rewards his readers. And maybe also for those who are interested in historiography, there is Ammienus Marcellinus, also available in the Lab, who is a strikingly entertaining late antique historian. He thinks of himself as Tacitus, and he tells us about the rule of Julian, but he also has accounts, for instance, of when he got trapped into the city of Amida during a Persian siege or stuff like that. So
Excellent. So Julian and Ammianus Marcellinus, both of whom are available in Lerb,
yes, both
and perhaps other
translated.
editions as well.
Yeah.
Excellent.